What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Pioneer video. And just a few months ago I had made a video talking about the Pioneer format and the problems that the format was facing, what they could do to change them. And now that we've had a pretty major banning and of course the US National Championship at DreamHack Atlanta happen, which the format featured was Pioneer, and we got some more results past kind of that big weekend of Magic, we can kind of see how the metagame has shaken out to this point and make some inferences on possibly what the format could look like going into 2024. Now, of course, before I get too deep into that, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more content like this, I also do a lot of modern content and some other longer form videos. If any of that stuff interests you, please consider subscribing to the channel, ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. Leave a like on the video as well if you do enjoy it. It does help out with the algorithm a lot. It's an easy way to support my channel and gets more people watching the videos so I can keep putting out awesome content, hopefully like this. If you go down in the description below, I'll kind of link the Pioneer Metagame website, MTG Goldfish, in the description, along with the Discord server as well. If you want to go over there and join, I would be very much appreciative of that. So, without further ado, let's go ahead. I'm going to kind of make some parallels. I'm going to talk about what I talked about in the last video, kind of the problem with Pioneer. If you haven't checked out that video or anything, please go check it out. I definitely go in detail of exactly kind of what's going on in the Pioneer metagame. But in short, we had essentially a rotation of like 3 different decks taking, the top spot, and they kind of rotated between 1, 2, and 3. You had a lot of like Rakdos midrange, you had Rakdos sacrifice, and you had like mono green. You occasionally had decks like Boros Convoke kind of make its way up into like the top 5. You had mono white that was hanging around in there. You had like Gruul aggro that would kind of show up, but like mainly, Rakdos mid-range. Izzet Phoenix towards the end there before the bannings started to become a really popular deck again in the format. So, for, 2-3 months and really even months before that, it was a lot of Rakdos mid-range, Rakdos sacrifice. So, I mean, really just like 2 Rakdos decks that right now have like a almost 21% metagame share. That was probably nearing like 30 to 40% to play against just a Rakdos deck, period, and you had to figure it out from there. And of course, you had Mono Green, who had essentially access to, a very powerful Game 1 game plan, but then with the Karn package, had just infinite options to either hate out the opponent to slow them down, to then, they could eventually go infinite, and of course, getting to play some of their cards that went infinite in their sideboard to then, be able to win the game in various ways that ultimately were pretty unfun, I would say. And the fact that mono green in itself is, very hard to attack through once they kind of get their board set up, and you have to try to interact with the creatures, and some of the creatures are just uninteractable with because they do generate value, especially when you are able to get rid of them if you just destroy them, not when you exile them or anything like that, which, aside from Azorius Control, not very many decks were doing that, at least not the top decks in the format. So we talked about in that video, Karn the Great Creator needed to go. This was before the Lost Caverns of Ixalan set came out, so like Geological Appraiser wasn't even a thing yet. So before like that combo deck kind of gave rise to, another kind of like toxic play pattern in the format. We had mono green doing mono green things that just like would fluctuate in being the best deck in the format and being a big problem to still being a big problem, but like being the second or third most played deck. I kind of attribute it to being like Amulet Titan, to like kind of draw a parallel in Modern, where I think it is a decently difficult deck to play. But a lot of times you have players that can kind of get away with less than optimal play that can just kind of win the game just by getting to play big creatures, turn them sideways, and then eventually you generate enough mana that you can play a Karn and go infinite, and your opponents really can't do anything about it, and the game is over essentially. And if you kind of know or understand like the win condition of sorts, by getting to loop the Stone Brain to mill your opponent's whole library, very slow on Moto, but very quick if you play in paper. because you can start naming cards, look through their whole deck, etc., so on. Of course, we got a banning just a week or two before the regional championship that said Geological Appraiser and Karn the Great Creator were banned, and Mono Green obviously taking a big hit. I mean, not anywhere, not in the top 10 decks. You don't even see like a Mono Green deck having any like postings in the last 14 days, in the top 15 decks, which is pretty insane given the fact that, again, it was like a top 3 deck at the time before that happened. And then of course the Geological Appraiser deck, these Discover decks and stuff, is stuck to being like the Quintorius versions where they play the Planeswalker instead. Not really a huge deal in terms of, format health, because at least, it's a 5-mana card. There's a little bit more restrictions when you can't play cards that are, you can only play specific cards that cost 4 or less instead of, getting to play 3 or less, because, you had all these different combos that you could set up to then just like win the game if you resolve this one piece, which I think we should probably promote Pioneer as a more interactive format and a little bit more fun and I guess less broken feeling than Modern, because the expectation is that Pioneer is kind of like what Modern was back in the mid to late 2010s, and then Modern is slowly becoming like the Legacy version of it, and then Legacy is now more vintage, essentially like this idea that we're not necessarily, creating a new format, but we're kind of rotating the formats to like older and older, where we're kind of putting them in these groups based on how much they cost to play, and kind of like the unfair and broken things that we have been playing and what we're used to from like older formats. And obviously you get to like Standard and Pioneer, the idea is that like the power level is a little bit lower. You have in the case of Standard, you have a limited card pool, and then in Pioneer, like, you kind of expand that a little bit and kind of takes on like a role of Extended, but obviously a lot bigger than like Extended was back in the day. And you have some powerful strategies and essentially like the greatest hits of Standard, kind of like what Modern was when Modern was introduced, that you would kind of get these decks that, were pretty good in their time in Standard, arguably one of the best decks, and then you kind of expand the card pool, and then they obviously get better because there are more sets available, and other archetypes can rise up because now decks that maybe didn't have access to a card, end up getting that card and could end up just completely transforming their identity, their entire game plan. Maybe they end up playing with different cards. They get just strict upgrades, so on. And Pioneer has kind of failed to do that in like the last year. We had Mono Green Devotion, back when Nykthos was Standard legal, but it's way more powerful when you have like mana sinks like Karn the Great Creator to go into your sideboard and get all these powerful colorless options that you see that can either end the game straight up for your opponent by being able to, again, create an infinite combo where you can make infinite mana, have infinite Planeswalker activations, mill your opponent's entire deck, or just get these targeted hate pieces that essentially make it hard for your opponent's deck to function and play around, when they not only have to beat your imposing board, but they also have to beat the hate that you play as well. And of course, whether you think Pioneers should be kind of like the greatest hits of Standard, plus maybe a few archetypes that didn't necessarily exist or really weren't fleshed out, is neither here nor there. The problem still lies with the fact that we have decks that are just overwhelmingly dominating the meta. And as you can see here, we have Rakdos Midrange, you have Is It Phoenix. These were two decks that we kind of expected to be winners of the ban announcement after it was announced. Karn the Great Creator, Mono Green, gone. Geological Appraiser, the Discover deck is essentially dead. That version was more popular than like the Quintorius version. I think the Quintorius version is still pretty good, but obviously when you can play, with 4 or greater to kind of do things versus, 5 or greater, so you don't discover into it, etc., and so on, is obviously easier to play the previous version, but, Quintorius is still fine. So we expected Rakdos Midrange, Is It Phoenix to kind of develop into these decks that are like super powerful, and they're going to kind of be the decks to beat going into at least RC Atlanta, and going forward from that point. Then you have Abzan Amelia combo, which is a deck that is capable of just winning the game on turn 3. like just straight up actually just win the game on turn 3. Now, if your opponent obviously plays interaction, which Rakdos midrange and Izzet Phoenix do, and they are able to kind of beat the combo before it gets out of hand. Really, if they're not set up or they're not in a way that they can really interact with the board, or maybe they try to, extend their presence by playing something like a Fable of the Mirror Breaker or playing a Ledger Shredder, what have you. Anything like that, if they end up tapping out, like they just lose the game. If your opponent isn't interacting with you in that way and they tap out or they just don't have any creature interaction, they lose the game. It's super punishing. It's a deck that can just win out of nowhere, and then once it kind of does its thing, even if you're able to destroy the creature after it just, explodes and blows up the board, you end up having a return to the ranks, and you're going to get, essentially your board back, and you're going to be able to go into another return to the ranks or what have you, or just be able to return a bunch of creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield that you've milled by doing your whole combo, and, just putting a huge board into play and telling your opponent to essentially figure it out. Like, what are you going to do about all this, and you still have to beat me with a bunch of life. So even if you combo like on turn 1, you win game 1, this deck is capable of kind of stalling later on and kind of doing what the Heliod combo decks did in Modern way back when, where you just end up gaining infinite life, what feels like infinite life, and it's hard for your opponent to kind of beat through that, especially when they're on a time crunch after playing, game 1 and having to try to win game 2 to even have a chance to tie, going into game 3. Azorius Control is a deck that's obviously existed. I think has gotten a lot better now that the metagame is kind of pushed into like these few decks which you want to interact. You want the exile base removal for like the Phoenix deck, and even the Amelia combo deck as well works out really nicely, so they can't actually use their like reanimator stuff to return those threats to the battlefield. So I think Azorius Control is in a pretty good position for that reason. Now, the fact that, of course, their targeted removal is going to be very powerful, and Mono Green isn't really here to overwhelm them. And Izzet Phoenix is like the deck that might be able to get like the jump on Azorius Control. That said, I like Azorius Control's position to kind of stop, these cantrips and like value pieces from Phoenix, and be able to kind of go 1-for-1 with Rakdos midrange on just simply getting to play at instant speed, interact with their creatures meaningfully, and of course, put in some big threats and kind of like get some card advantage going before Rakdos midrange is actually able to kind of control the game in that aspect, to where like their top deck is going to be better than yours. Well, it's not going to be better when you're drawing 2-3 cards a turn versus their 1 for turn. Going deeper, Boros Convoke, essentially it's like a super fast aggro deck that can win the game pretty early, but when you have Amelia combo that can, put a lethal threat into play on turn 3, there's just no point. Maybe a little bit more consistent, but, arguably Amelia combo can also be very consistent with 8 different ways to essentially like find or have a chance at getting your combo into play. Hidden Strings still showing very strong at 5%. Rakdos Sacrifice taking a big fall. I think it really wanted to play against like Mono Green, just for the fact that Mono Green can kind of dirtle around, and Rakdos Sacrifice can kind of do the same thing, but it can actually kill your opponent and put pressure on them and kind of like force them into messing up in some ways. That said, like I still don't think like Mono Green is like an insane matchup for them. So the fact that like these two decks are still around and like can still interact with like Amelia combo, and that's so far down here is pretty strange. And of course, like Gruul Aggro being like this value-y like vehicle deck that you can essentially kind of go big early on and just get through tons and tons of damage with some of the other dorks that are around. So really, ultimately the metagame really hasn't changed that much. I mean, like these decks, I think we're kind of resigned to being in the lower tiers and lower echelons of the format. We have 2 decks that are not surprising that they're up here because they were just the most played to begin with, and then they didn't lose anything, so they continue to be the most played. You have the new combo deck that could just straight up win on turn 3, but is super resilient, and you need like effective creature removal and graveyard hate as well, because if you have one or the other, like it's just going to use the other to end up beating you. And control, which everybody absolutely hates a counterspell. me included. But ultimately, I think this is like fine. I think of all the decks that are like towards the top of the format, I think Azorius Control is kind of fine seeing a lot of play, just because I think it has a satisfying kind of like gameplay to it, for the fact it feels like you're winning forever, and the games you're losing, you're pretty much out of like almost instantly. So, but it does have a decent like catch up mechanic as well. So take that for what you will. So overall, Pioneer is kind of in a long-winded way, of course, because I like to over-explain everything and really try to go in depth. The Pioneer metagame is kind of in the same place that it was, a few months ago, and even towards like the middle of the year, where we have a lot of the same decks that are taking up, a crazy amount of the metagame share. I mean, essentially almost a third of the decks that you're going to play in a given tournament, on average, are going to either be Rakdos or is it Phoenix. I think both create games that are not necessarily fun, just from the fact of like from the Is It Phoenix side, you end up putting like two or three Phoenixes into play. Then it's like bad for your opponent, because it's like I don't really understand how I would beat this, and how you beat it consistently in like game ones. Where like game twos and game threes, it might get a little bit easier, but by and large, like Is It Phoenix has ways of like playing around those things, so like it's not fun because you're essentially in a guessing game two and game three, on like how your opponent is going to sideboard against you, and you get into this thing of like, well, I'm going to bring in graveyard hate, so is it Phoenix is going to kind of go less on the Phoenixes, but then you think that they're going to take them out, so then you don't bring in graveyard hate, so you can be more effective against the creatures, but then so on, and we do this back and forth that really no one wins, and you're just kind of stuck with a coin flip decision anyway. Rakdos mid range, I think, is really powerful, and it's really weird to say that a mid range deck is super powerful, because it's just playing very aggressively costed cards at their mana cost on curve. I just think with your Shieldreds, your Bone Crusher Giants are very efficient. Now Smuggler's Copter being introduced, Blood Tithe Harvester is a really powerful card. Fable the Mirror Breaker is a really powerful card. I really thought Fable, of all things, should have also been banned. We kind of have like a Hogak, Is It Phoenix sort of situation in Modern, where if we just saw Hogak get banned, then we weren't going to, we were just going to go back to Is It Phoenix being the best deck in the format, so then they banned Faithless Looting. I wanted the Faithless Looting card to be Fable the Mirror Breaker, so then that way there was at least some sort of shuffle. Like maybe you have Is It Phoenix up there, maybe you consider banning something else, so that that's something that targets specifically Is It Phoenix. Maybe you could do like the new Fairy or what have you. Maybe you could get rid of like Phoenix altogether. But by and large, kind of hoping for a more of a metagame shakeup with Pioneer. I mean, even though it was, but at the same time, as I've been saying, we're kind of in the same problem here. So for 2024, I expect, if nothing changes, like obviously the metagame's not going to change. I think you need some very powerful cards that end up getting printed into the Pioneer format, and while I like to see power creep, I like to see better cards get printed. I like to see things kind of get pushed, so we're not playing essentially the same game, just with different named pieces, or maybe even color shifted pieces and what have you. I also think that there needs to be a control necessarily on the power level, so that we see cards that are kind of more that are printed for standard being printed for like a Pioneer / standard level, and not like a modern level. I mean, we have all these straight to modern sets. We have little Universes Beyond with like Lord of the Rings. We're getting a Assassin's Creed set. We're getting a Modern Horizons set. For cards getting printed straight to modern, I think if you want cards that are, going to be powerful in modern, you print them so that they're not necessarily powerful in these newer formats, but are more powerful for the older formats, and then you save like the modern, the straight to modern stuff to print some of those more powerful and push designs for those formats specifically. And I think Pioneer, you kind of have to like start looking, with a fine tooth comb for these super oppressive strategies that just aren't necessarily fun, that aren't really that interactive, to see some positive change for the format and kind of go forward with a healthy metagame as it all stands. So that's just my take on it. Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. I would love to hear them. I'd love to talk with people. So please, if you have any of those opinions, thoughts, concerns, or just want to call me out on anything like that, please be sure to leave a comment down below how you feel. Of course, leave a like on the video as well if you enjoyed the video. could subscribe to the channel if you aren't already subscribed so you can see more videos like this. Of course, ring the notification bell so you know when said videos get posted. And if you are interested in looking at the Pioneer metagame, checking out deck lists, stuff like that, MTG Goldfish, I mean, something that I use for all my videos is awesome. It's a great resource. You know, if you want to learn the format, if you want to see what's being played, you want ideas for decks, so on, you know, MTG Goldfish is awesome. Go over there. And I also have a Discord link in the description as well if you want to go follow that link and join as well. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.